Have truer words ever been spoken? Welcome to week 4 of the fantasy football season. My name is Drew Garino, of course, to bring you this week's action in the League of Legends fantasy football season. Now, it was a big week for some last week. We have two gentlemen who sit atop the standings at a 3-0 record. Ryan and Cam Ahern both lead the way in the League of Legends this year in the early going. Will that continue? Both have very difficult matchups this week. So without further ado, let's bring you the action for week 4 of the fantasy football season. Firstly, we're going to look at Dennis, who comes in with a record at 1-2, versus Bill, who is now 0-3 on the season. Dennis, for him, has Russell Wilson playing in the Monday Night Football game at home versus Detroit. Now, I liked what I saw in the second half from Russell Wilson, started connecting a little bit more with Jimmy Graham. So I like for that to continue. Detroit is certainly reeling, having lost their first 3 games of the season. So Russell Wilson, for me, is a must start, and he's going to have a great game on Monday Night Football. Now, a guy that I'm looking at for Dennis, who I'm not that high on this week, is TJ Yeldon. He's going up against the Colts on the road. Seems on paper as a very favorable matchup. However, I thought last week was a favorable matchup for him, and he really didn't see a lot of action. I thought he'd be catching more balls. I thought he'd have the ability to run the ball through the New England defense. He did not. I don't like the trend there, and I think the Colts are really going to start to put things together sooner rather than later. Granted, their defense isn't great, but for me, TJ Yeldon's a guy I'm going to take a surprise no on this week. Now for Bill, speaking of Jimmy Graham, he's a guy I love this week at home against Detroit. So Dennis really needs to hope that Jimmy Graham is not as involved as I think he's going to be, because that really could work against him this week. But Jimmy Graham for me is someone who really started to get going last week. They found creative ways to get him the ball, and I like for that to continue. I think it's a good sign of things to come for Jimmy Graham and the Seattle offense. Now a guy that I am down on is a guy I've been down on before, Alfred Morris for me, at home against Philadelphia. Right now, there's a real big timeshare going on in the Washington backfield. The guys that are really involved are Alfred Morris and Matt Jones, who is also back there, a rookie out of Florida. Alfred Morris, to me, is a guy who could have a good game, but it's because of that timeshare situation that I don't like his matchup for the week. With all that being taken into consideration, I will take Dennis to move to 2-2 on the young season. The next matchup we're looking at is our first place participant right now, Ryan, who sits at 3-0, against Dave, who had a big win last week, moving to 1-2. Now for Ryan, I'm going to go with Matt Ryan as the guy that I think will have a great game this week. He's at home against Houston. He's been finding Julio Jones on multiple occasions. They are really moving the ball well on all cylinders. In Atlanta, they have Devonta Freeman there as well. So I like for Matt Ryan to have a big game at home against Houston. Now, a guy that I'm down on this week, and it's tough because Ryan has a lot of holes on his roster as of this taping, but Martellus Bennett for me is a guy who's going to be playing for him. He is playing against Oakland at home. Again, very favorable matchup, but the reason why I put him in the down category is because of Jimmy Clausen. Believe he had 63 yards passing. Granted, it's Seattle, and Oakland is not anywhere close to the defense that Seattle has. But Jimmy Clausen, for me, is a huge red flag. So that will directly and negatively impact Martellus Bennett this week against Oakland. Now for Dave, who was off that big win, he starts Carlos Williams at home against the New York Giants. Carlos Williams has found the end zone in each of his first 3 games. I like for that trend to continue. LaShawn McCoy is out of the lineup, so Carlos Williams, to me, becomes a very, very good start for Dave's roster. Now, a guy I'm down on for Dave this week is Matt Jones. We talked a little bit with Bill's team about Alfred Morris. Again, I'm not down on the player. I'm just down on the timeshare situation that's going on there. They're going to be working against each other. I don't like it. So for me, Matt Jones against Philly, again, pretty favorable matchup. But because of that timeshare situation, I don't love his opportunities this week. With that being said, I'm going to go on the limb here and pick Dave to win this matchup, give Ryan his first loss on the season. The reason really is the injuries that have really taken a toll on Ryan's running back committee. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Dave to win and move to 2-2. The next matchup we have is Adam versus Steve. Adam is coming in with a record of 2-1, put up a big point total last week. Steve is in at 1-2 and really needs a win to get back to that 500 level. Now for Adam, Steve Smith Sr. had a monster game last week. He's been seeing the Yeoman share of the targets the last couple of games, and that will continue. He's playing on the road at Pittsburgh. We all know the Pittsburgh secondary isn't what it used to be, so I think Steve Smith could see a lot of activity tonight in the Thursday night game. Guy that I've been down on, just mainly due to injury, Ladarius Green is at home against Cleveland. Another situation. Favorable matchup on paper, but Ladarius Green has a concussion. He's had a few concussions in his career, and to me, that's a huge red flag. They don't have Antonio Gates back quite yet, but Ladarius Green, if he's able to go, I don't know how full strength he's really going to be. So for that reason, I'm going to put him in the down category for Adam's team. Looking at Steve's roster, a guy that really broke out last week and has had really a strong start to the season, has vaulted into the top 10 in terms of running backs. Latavius Murray is facing off at Chicago. I love the matchup. Oakland's been moving the ball very well this year. David Carr thus far has had a very strong start. Latavius Murray is the reason for David Carr's really positive play. He's really helped keep the defenses honest, and I like for him to have a big game at Chicago. Chicago is in flux. They just traded away two of their defensive starters, so that's a great matchup for Latavius Murray this week on the road. A guy that I've been down on really all season, and it's really come to fruition, unfortunately, for Steve's roster. Andre Johnson is at home against Jacksonville. He was benched in the fourth quarter of that game last week on the road at Tennessee. That does not bode well for Steve in the future. If Andre Johnson is going to fall behind that depth chart, guys like Dante Moncrief and T.Y. Hilton are really going to catapult over him. That's not a good sign. He's an older guy, so Andre Johnson for me is in the down category this week. Now, looking at the rosters as a whole, I'm going to take Adam to win this one and move up the standings closer to the top at 3-1. Now we're going to look at the battle of 173 Fulton Street, and that brings us to Drew, who is 1-2, against Sean, who is also 1-2 on the season. Looking at Drew's team, devastating injury to Ben Roethlisberger last week at the quarterback position. So the replacement this week is Tyrod Taylor versus the Giants at home. Love the matchup, like the player so far this year. He's really put up some big numbers. He had some big numbers in that New England game, mainly in the second half. He demolished the Dolphins on the road last week. The Giants have been really, really poor in the secondary. So Tyrod Taylor could be the beneficiary of that favorable matchup. So I like him to be in that up category this week for Drew's team. Now looking at the downside, Pierre Garçon is going up against Philly. Again, another favorable matchup. However, it's been too inconsistent. Is Deshaun Jackson going to be back there? There's a lot of moving parts with that Washington offense. Right now, Jordan Reed really looks like the number one target in terms of the passing game for the Redskins. So Pierre Garçon is kind of an up-and-down player. If he doesn't score a touchdown, his numbers are very pedestrian. He's really a touchdown-dependent guy in fantasy football. Looking at Sean's team, monster game last week, would continue to see a number of targets from Aaron Rodgers is Randall Cobb. He is playing on the road against San Francisco. Basically, anyone going up against the San Francisco defense at this point is going to be an automatic A-plus start. So Randall Cobb, for me, will get his usual touches. He will find the end zone. He's going to have a big week this week for the Packers. Now, a guy I'm down on is a guy that's shown real flashes of being a strong player, but I just didn't like the way he looked last week. Amir Abdullah is on the road at Seattle. Very tough matchup. It goes without saying. Detroit is an absolute mess on both sides of the ball. Stafford looks hurt and horrible, but Amir Abdullah, they're going to get down in the game, and they're not going to be able to get him the ball as much as they need to. So for me, he's not going to be a guy that's going to put up the necessary points that warrants a start this week for Sean's roster. Now, looking at this, it should be a pretty close matchup. There's a lot of question marks in terms of injuries on Drew's team right now. Arian Foster, Devonta Freeman. But I will take my chances. I will go with myself to move to 2-2 and Sean to fall to 1-3. That brings us to our matchup of the week. We are looking at Bud Ahern, who comes in with a record of 2-1. Impressive win last week over Drew to overtake him on Monday Night Football. And Cam, who is sitting atop the standings at 3-0, coming into play. Now, looking at Bud's team, I like Emmanuel Sanders this week at home against Minnesota. Minnesota has actually been pretty good against the deep ball this year. That bodes very well for Emmanuel Sanders. For a lot of those underneath throws, he should see a ton of catches, a lot of targets. That will really help in this PPR format. So Emmanuel Sanders is the guy I love this week. A guy I'm not high on this week, and again, because of the matchup, Carlos Hyde is at home against Green Bay. They will get down in that game very early. It's going to be difficult for him to see a lot of action because of that score. Because Green Bay is so dominant right now and San Francisco just doesn't know what they're doing on offense at this point. Carlos Hyde, for me, great player. Unfortunately, he's not going to have a good week this week. Looking at Cam's roster, overtaking Andre Johnson by far and looks like recovered from his injury is T.Y. Hilton, who was home against Jacksonville. I will think that even with Luck banged up right now, the Colts are really going to start to put things together on offense. T.Y. Hilton is getting stronger. He feels better. I think he's in line for a very big game against a weak Jacksonville secondary this week. A guy I'm down on this week for Cam's roster is a guy who had a great week last week. He was able to start because of some injuries at some other to the main running back in Andre Ellington. That's Chris Johnson, who is playing at home against St. Louis. We all know that St. Louis is a very strong defensive line, but the real reason I'm putting him in the down category this week is because of Andre Ellington's impending return. It's still 50-50 on whether or not he's going to play. Most people seem to think that he will. Either way, I don't like Chris Johnson this week. I don't think he's going to have as strong of a week as he did last week. And again, with Ellington potentially coming back, that's only going to make things cloudier for that backfield in Arizona. But looking at the rosters as a whole, again, I'm going to go with a little bit of an upset here. I'm going to take Bud to win this matchup. He's going to knock off Cam. So I have both Cam and Ryan losing this week, falling back to 3-1. Bud and Adam winning to moving to 3-1. So we should see a quick log jam here at the top of the League of Legends standings if all goes according to plan. But that's what I think. What do you think? We'd love to hear your feedback on the predictions this week. Best of luck to everybody out there. Enjoy the bye week.